Good evening and welcome to Flat Earth United Kingdom. Joining me on this very brisk evening is Bob, otherwise known as Xanadu. How are you doing, Bob?
Doing great, Nathan. Glad to be here, and thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And also joining us is Stephen Chess. How are you doing, Stephen?
Doing good. How about you, Nathan?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad at all. We're going to kick off with the first and most important Flat Earth related question to me, which is going to be directed straight at Bob, which is, Bob, how did you find out Earth is flat?
Well, it really probably came a lot easier to me than it did to a lot of people because at the time that I kind of figured out that the Earth was flat, I was researching NASA and their fakery, and it took me, it just boggled my mind why everything they did seemed to be fabricated. And so I started looking into it more and more and more, and I'd actually been looking into it for about 9 months. And I was also a very avid reader of Clues Forum, and one of the contributors to Clues Forum had actually started mentioning something about geocentricity and the possibility of flat Earth. And initially I thought, like most people, this is ridiculous, that's completely absurd, can never happen. But this particular guy had such a great sense of humor that I really liked him as a writer. So I kept reading what he had to say and chuckling at what he had to say. And then, before I knew it, I was thinking, wow, this guy really has a lot of valid points about this. And from that point, I started searching on YouTube for YouTube videos on it, searching the web to see other people's takes on it. And honestly, it did not take me very long when I started thinking back on it, especially with my flight experience as a pilot, that it's like, we really don't make any concessions for flat Earth or anything like that. So I was at that point about 90%, and it didn't take much longer to get the other 10%. Now there's no doubt in my mind that it's absolutely flat.
When was that exactly?
This is about, I'd say about a year and a half ago. So, because I've been doing Globebusters for a bit over, what, I think 15 months or something like that, 16 months. So it wasn't too long before I started doing Globebusters.
Sure, and then you got in touch with Jaron and supplied him a laser.
Yep, got in touch with Jaron, supplied him a laser, and that kind of struck up that friendship. And we had a ton of phone calls, and we found that philosophically we agreed on a whole lot of things. So it was awesome. Really, really enjoyed Jaron. And next thing we know, we're doing a hangout together, and it went so well that we decided to start doing it weekly. And then, of course, as you know, it turned into bi-weekly. We picked up TJ, and it's been kind of going ever since.
So this might sound like a strange question, but for those who don't know, what is geocentricity?
Well, geocentricity is, it's basically the flat Earth. It would be a geocentric model, but geocentricity differs in that the idea is that the sun goes around the Earth instead of the other way around, which of course is called heliocentricity. So their model is a little bit different. If anybody's familiar with Robert Sungenis, he covers the geocentric angle fairly well. But of course, the thing that I have never been able to get behind in the geocentric model is the fact that these stars, which are allegedly thousands of light years away, would have to be going around us at these enormous speeds. And to me, that just doesn't wash. Not only that, they claim that there is, they claim that the stars are actually moving and changing positions. There is parallax, but I've never seen it, nor have I seen it measured. And anything I think that could be misinterpreted as parallax is probably some sort of optical phenomenon.
Right. Well, maybe we'll go on to parallax a bit later, but before we do, what's the key details about the subject, and I'm going to put it in these terms, but flat Earth? What is it about the subject that has brought you to the point where you now absolutely know that the world is not a globe?
Well, I think probably the best answer to that is a preponderance of evidence. And by that, I mean that there's several things that factored into it. One, I started looking at the idea of this being a spinning ball, and that is fairly easily debunked in several different areas. Okay, so once I got past that, then I started thinking about, some of the things that Eric Dubé said, about the horizon always rising to eye level, and it does unequivocally. You can look 360 degrees around you, and so I look at stuff like that, and I also think that flat Earth has some things about it that simply cannot be explained in the ball Earth model. For example, gyroscopes. Okay, when I think about gyroscopes, they are unequivocally absolute proof of not only the Earth not moving, which of course we already knew, but as a pilot, when you're flying along over the flat Earth, the gyroscopes do not precess at all. And of course, a lot of people have come up with the counter argument that, well, that's because they have this effect called Schuler tuning, and Schuler tuning turns out to be largely a myth. And in fact, if you listen to some of the people that Mark Sargent had on his show, they had a mechanism that was supposedly a part of the Schuler tuning mechanism that had failed, and they decided that they could go along and just check in with air traffic control to get these corrections for it. Well, it turned out that there was never any correction for it, which tells me that, of course, the Schuler tuning mechanism was completely unnecessary. So the gyroscopes would be another thing, the horizon rising to eye level, and I mean, so many other things that simply, cannot happen on a ball Earth. Now, some people will say that there are proofs, supposedly, that the Earth is a spinning ball, and some of those would be like the Coriolis effect, which I think is fairly easily debunked. The largest argument that a lot of people have, and we've taken this on pretty directly, is the southern stars, the northern and southern stars rotating in each different direction. Well, that was a conundrum for quite a while, and there are actually two very likely probabilities, actually, and they kind of feed into each other. One is that we are in a magnetic field, and of course we know that the Earth does have a magnetic field. And if you look at the spin of magnetic fields, you have the centripetal and the centrifugal spins going in each direction at each side of the pole. And one could apply that to the Earth, the flat Earth, where the North Pole is spinning in one direction, and you go out towards the outer edge of the ring, so to speak, and it's spinning in the opposite direction. But the biggest thing that I think that really is emerging as a major debunking of the stars is, first of all, the flat earthers do not believe that the stars are thousands of light years away. And I think there's a good body of evidence that kind of goes along with that, in that, one of the things we are trying to prove with our balloon launch, which we will be having again very soon because I do have another balloon, is that once we get up above 50,000 feet, that the stars are simply going to fade away. Now, we already know that this happens because, as I talked about on Globebusters, Rendra AZ had found a mainstream study that was done by several scientific institutions and colleges that were showing that, geez, they were trying to get some shots of the stars going up, and every time they go up, beyond 35,000 feet, the stars would simply disappear. So what they wound up doing ultimately was equipping the camera with special filters. Okay, there was kind of a yellow filter that essentially emulated about 40,000 feet of atmosphere. And when they did that and then sent up the balloon, then lo and behold, the stars came back into view. But every time that they had done this, and they had been doing this for over a period of 3 years, every time they got up 35, 40, 50,000 feet, the stars were absolutely invisible. And of course, then you have other people like Eric Dollard that are saying that, no, you can't see the sun in space. You have Peter Lindemann that's saying that you can't see the sun in space, that the atmosphere is absolutely required for us to be able to see them. Well, if that's the truth, and I believe it absolutely is, then there is no way that NASA's model of these visible light reaching us from thousands of light years away could possibly be true. Other things that definitely debunk that is the inverse square law, which basically dictates that the further as you get away from a source, either it's RF or light or anything like that, it is inversely proportional to the light energy that's going to reach you. Well, you know, you start thinking about light, how bright a light would have to be to travel thousands of light years, and it just gets beyond ridiculous. So getting back to, you know, the model of the stars, then, if the stars are not thousands of light years away, then that means that we are not in a spinning ball in the middle of a star field, which means that any observation of the star field rotating in opposite directions is completely invalid, because it cannot actually be a real star field. But what is more likely is, because we're in a magnetic construct, is that we're simply looking at the magnetic lines of flux, and there is some sort of like a sonoluminescent manifestation causing the stars. So that's it in kind of a nutshell.
The sonoluminescent effect would have to be causally linked to us on the ground, though. I say this because there's a lot of people who say, well, what's above us isn't our ground that we walk on. However, I take a bit of offense to that, in the respect that I think we absolutely influence what's going on above our heads. I mean, I'll maybe come back to that a bit later, because we've skipped over something that I thought was quite crucial, which is about gyroscopes. And I think I'm right in saying that Foucault actually named them gyroscopes. And he has got plenty of things that would be suggesting that we can prove or visually see the Earth spinning beneath us, with another experiment that has his name attached to it. I mean, this was something that was thrown at me many, many times back in the day. It seems like years ago. It's probably only 12 months ago. But you have this contradiction with Foucault's pendulum, where it's a demonstration of the Earth spinning. Maybe you can explain to us where that contradiction lies.
Well, I think the contradiction lies in its inconsistency. It simply is not. The Foucault pendulum will periodically stop and switch directions for no apparent reason. Now, if the Foucault pendulum is indeed tracking some sort of energetic signature in the sky, like possibly the sun and the moon being very local phenomenon rotating around us, then that would explain a lot. Because interestingly enough, when you have certain astronomical events like eclipses or, you know, specific alignments, these are the things that seem to affect the change in direction on the Foucault's pendulum. So that in and of itself, you know, invalidates the Foucault pendulum altogether. The other thing that Foucault is not so famous for, and people don't realize this, and you mentioned this a minute ago, is the gyroscope. And Foucault allegedly had detected precession in the gyroscope that he had. And of course, this took place 160, 70 years ago, something like that. And back then, they simply did not have the precision machining that we do today. I have this gyroscope sitting right back here behind me. I don't know if you can see it, but this is one of those, I'll just show it to you here. This is one of those little $250 gyroscopes that, you know, you can spin up to 12,000 RPM, and it will run for a half an hour easily. And lo and behold, there is not one iota of precession, which tells us that we're not spinning, and there is no angular motion whatsoever. Now, I'm going to be sending this particular gyroscope to Jonathan, I believe, who's the flight instructor in Iowa, who's going to be running a whole series of experiments with the gyroscope on his aircraft there, because he owns a flight school and everything. And he's going to be looking at a few specific things that we ask him to, in that he's going to spin up this gyro on the ground to about 12,000 RPM, keep cameras on it. He's going to take off, and he's going to kind of be comparing the cockpit instruments, the cockpit gyroscopic instruments, to this particular gyro. And I anticipate that they are going to agree 100% right down the line, because, you know, most of the general aviations, or probably all the general aviation aircraft, have no such mechanism as Schuler tuning. And also the fact that this gyro has no pendulous vanes in it, you simply cannot make the pendulous vanes argument to, you know, try and debunk the gyroscope. So, you know, this is just going to be something else that we can present as visual evidence that that shows, once again, that Foucault lied about the pendulum, and the entire concept, or the entire idea behind the pendulum is flawed deeply.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. Because of the interference that it has during eclipses, it definitely suggests that its motion, its precession is being dictated by, the luminary bodies that we see on a larger scale, like the sun and moon. However, the heliocentric system tells us that it's showing the Earth spinning beneath us, and yet we have the Coriolis effect, which is dragging along all the atmosphere. Therefore, it shouldn't be able to demonstrate that. I mean, it is a farce when they use it as a proof that we spin. But yeah, while we're on the subject of planes actually flying around, maybe you can explain how that gyroscope will prove lack of curvature, which is essentially what you're trying to actually achieve there.
Okay, well, that's very simple. When a pilot is flying, the first thing that we're always told is to keep our eye on the horizon, or just find a point on the windshield or on the plane itself and line it up with the horizon. And basically, you don't even really need to look at any instruments. However, in straight and level flight, the gyroscope will indicate on the artificial horizon, well, a straight and level flight. Your nose will be directly even with it. So if we were on a ball that had curvature, then if as we're flying along, we would have to conform to the curvature of the ball in order to maintain our altitude. And of course, the altitude is given to us by two different mechanisms. One, of course, is through barometric pressure through the altimeter. And we also have the rate of climb indicator, which is another type of gyroscopic instrument that will give us our angle in relation to the horizon. Okay, so if we're flying along and we're keeping level flight, and our barometric altimeter and our radar altimeter and every altimeter is telling us that we are at a fixed distance from the ground, and we keep flying away, well, there would have to be curvature that you would have to compensate for and push the nose down in order to keep your flight level. Well, that never happens. That doesn't happen in small planes. It doesn't happen in jets. It doesn't happen at supersonic speed. It just doesn't happen. And that, right there is a really good indicator that there is no curvature to the Earth. And of course, like I said, the rebuttal to that is typically, oh, that's because the instruments are taking care of that. It's like, no, they're not. It's not built into it. I've talked to people at the DIA avionics repair shop. Several flat earthers have called the manufacturers of these, and there is no mechanism that allows for curvature of the Earth. So, when you start looking at things like that, again, it just starts building up that preponderance of evidence. There's so many things that A, debunk the ball, and B, not the least of which are our own senses that tell us that we are on a flat Earth. And pretty soon it gets to the point where it's absolutely overwhelming. We know that the Earth is flat, unequivocally.
Yeah, I mean, moving from lack of curvature and gyroscopes onto water, and it's apt that you're having a nice sip of it at the exact perfect moment. So yeah, I mean, water at rest always finds its perfect level. I mean, that's a simple fact that we can all observe on almost any scale. I know we did the Bedford level here in the UK recently, but maybe you can pad that out a bit and explain, or give that a bit more meat.
Okay, well, I mean, I really don't know a whole lot to add to that. Anybody that's ever played with water at all, I mean, it's very simple to see that it always does seek out level. Now, granted, there are surface features to the flat Earth that are not flat. Like, I live in Colorado. We, right next to the Rocky Mountains. The Continental Divide is here in Colorado, and obviously, that when you have an angle with respect to sea level that is not level with it, then water is going to flow down that hill until it hits sea level, right? And beyond that, nobody has ever witnessed the curvature. You can look, people say, well, you can see boats go over the horizon, which is a ridiculous argument. And I think that's been debunked so well that it's not even really worth addressing, especially when you consider the fact that the Globers will say, well, you have to be over 40,000 or 50,000 or 60,000 feet to see the curve, and yet you can be standing at the shore of the ocean and supposedly see a boat disappear over the curvature within 5 or 6 miles. That's patently absurd, right? And not only that, if you can look 5 to 6 miles out to the horizon, or however far away you can see to the horizon, but you can look easily left to right and double that distance or more and still see no curvature whatsoever, then there is no curvature. So again, water is remaining perfectly level. I mean, they have liquid inside of levels to indicate level. So any type of fluid, it's not just water, but any type of fluid will tend to do that. And air technically is considered a fluid. And ironically, you look at the sky and the clouds are never in an arc. They're never curving. They're always completely flat with respect to each other and with respect to the ground. So everything, and I mean everything, that we see and perceive is indicating to us that the Earth is flat. And there is not one iota of contradicting evidence to that cannot be easily debunked, either by not using a GoPro fisheye lens camera or some other very reasonable explanation. But frankly, I've never seen anything that even comes close to being a problem to debunk.
Sure. I always really like that explanation about seeing the boats go over the curvature. But if you're standing looking across at that same view, you can see them in the same way that person looking at it going over the horizon, presumably because of optics, will see a vast wide expanse, and there could be boats all the way along it. But of course, for a guy looking across from the other edge of that beach, he should be seeing a massive curve for each and every one of those boats. The simple fact is, we know the water is level. We know. It's just a simple fact. So it can't be curving around it. They give us a nice little word, which we haven't touched on until now, which would presumably explain all this away, that would stick this water to the spinning ball with no problem at all. And that's something that we were all taught in school, which is gravity. Yes. Something you've been touching on and looking at. I'm sure we'll come on to theorypothesis as well. But if you can tell us a little bit about, maybe start with their idea, and by their I mean the heliocentrists out there, their idea of gravity and where they might have a few things a little bit wrong.
Well, the heliocentric idea of gravity is simply the more mass that an object has, the more of a gravitational pull it will have. And of course, this idea is flawed from the get-go completely, because you think about, let's go all the way back to the beginning. What happened, for the Earth to finally coalesce into this perfect ball, right? There was a little piece of dust at one point, and then cling to another piece of dust or some other particulate. And before you knew it, they were all kind of attracting each other like magnets. And, a couple 100 million years later, we've got the Earth because everything is all stuck together. That entire concept is completely ludicrous in every way, shape, and form. And of course, if that was so true, then they would be able to make an experiment that actually demonstrated that. And of course, there are some experiments that have supposedly told us that, this is the way that it works, and it can be proven over and over and over again. But the reality is you go online and you try and watch these experiments, and none of them are ever successful. And I think it's funny because there's one particular person in the community who is not a flat earther, and that would be Charles Flat Earth Math, who I was reading some comments that he was writing to other people, and they were saying, hey, look, it's never been captured on video. We've never seen it. But he said, well, it was done millions of times, 400 years ago. And then the person was responding to him saying, well, yeah, except that we don't see it on video. We have no video proof of it at all. And Charles's answer was, of course, well, that's because they didn't have video cameras back then, which is kind of absurd. But this is the kind of cognitive dissonance on the ball earther side, that they'll come back with those.
Which experiment were they referring to?
Oh crap! The Cavendish experiment. Yes, the Cavendish experiment, which has supposedly been carried out thousands of times. And I've looked and looked and looked, and frankly, from what I've read about it, a lot of these professors say we've never been able to get it to work, which is no surprise because the whole idea of that is nonsense. Now, I have looked very deeply into the alternative methods of what they're calling gravity, or the alternative explanations, I should say, as to what they're calling gravity. And I think that theory apophysis pretty much nailed it when he gave his little example, which set me off doing the show on Globebusters, explaining it. But to put that in the nutshell for your viewers, is that theory apophysis said, gravity is exactly the same force as when you had an old style television set which had the CRT, and of course the CRTs used very high voltage from a device called a flyback transformer, which kicked it up to several thousand volts between the cathode and the anode. Well, as a result of that, there would be a high degree of static electricity on the front of that cathode ray tube. Okay, so Theoria was making the point that when you have one of these old CRTs and you have little dust particulates are drawn to it constantly, and they would always be dirty. You'd always have to clean out the front of them. And it wasn't just dust particulates. You could take little pieces of paper and throw it at it. It would stick to it. Almost anything, virtually everything, is influenceable by electrostatic energy. So I started really thinking about that because it hit home for me. And I started looking at the static electricity in the Earth atmosphere itself, because I've talked many times about being up on a tower 100 feet up in the air, and you touch something that's grounded and you get a pretty good zap. So I looked into that, and in mainstream physics definitely has a model for it in which they define this static potential as raising all the way up to 35 miles or something like that, 50 kilometers, I believe. And that is that for every meter that you go up, you have a difference of potential between 1 meter above the ground and the ground of 100 volts. You go up 2 meters, it's 200 volts. 3 meters, 300 volts. And he says that this goes all the way up to 50 kilometers. Well, if that's true, and I have no doubt that it is, and in fact, I found out since then that there are potential areas that are much higher than that, then by the time you get up to 50 kilometers, you have a 5 million volt difference of potential statically between Earth ground and whatever is up at that altitude. And I'm presuming, presumably, I'm looking at the Earth as some sort of a circuit. So I'm looking at possibly the firmament or whatever is up there as the anode to this circuit. Okay.
So we can actually visually see this with things like sprites, though, can't we?
Absolutely. Sprites and elves, when you see them discharge, and they will actually discharge up, they will seem to hit a plateau, and they'll flatten out on the top. And that would be very indicative of something that we can replicate in the lab that is showing very simply that it has reached the anode contact plates, or in this case, the firmament, which would be the charge. Okay.
So there've been a lot of words people have heard there that they're going to go, what? So we've talked about sprites. Maybe you can give it a bit of a visual padding so people know exactly what we're talking about.
Okay, well, I guess one of the easiest ways to visualize, this static potential in the air would be simply not only the sprites and elves, but lightning discharges as well. Okay, and lightning obviously has an extremely high voltage. And collectively it also has a fairly good amount of current to it, and it's not the voltage that will kill you. It's not the voltage that causes the harm. In fact, the voltage itself is a very weak attractive force, just like gravity, right? What brings the power to an electrical discharge would be the current flow, or the amperes. And the amperes, I guess a good way to do this, to put it in perspective, is if you were looking at an electrical circuit, okay, kind of think of it like a hose, okay? So when you have a hose attached to a spigot and you turn on the water faucet, that would be the voltage source, okay? And then you can kind of visualize the water going through the hose as the current, or the electron flow, okay? And then the hose itself is not only the conductor, but it can represent the resistance. If you put a kink in the hose, there is then a resistance to that current flow, okay? So you have the amount of energy being pushed from the spigot as the voltage source, the water going through it as the current source, and the hose as the resistance source. So if you kind of look at things in the area of like fluid, then you can kind of get a better idea of what's going on electrically. So when we go up in the air, okay, and we start getting this higher and higher potential for voltage, you can kind of make that akin to rain. Okay, so the water coming down, as it's coming down, it kind of gains speed and even collects a little bit more moisture. But there's definitely this potential that's drawing the rain down to the ground. Okay, and so and maybe that's not the world's best analogy, but the bottom line is that the Earth, if you take that CRT, like I was giving the example before, and you turn it so that it's facing up, the Earth has that static potential coming off of it, and it is that static potential that is between the Earth and the sky itself that is defining up from down. Okay, it has a very weak attractive force, just like the static electricity on the CRT, but what it does is it gives us our framework for determining actually up from down. And then at that point, then you can get into the buoyancy and density, which, you know, will determine different speeds of falling. Of course, the air will also slow things down as you get closer to the ground. The air gets denser, which will provide more of a resistance. And just like when you go into water, same thing. Water is has a much higher viscosity, and it will slow things down. So it's the static potential that is essentially what we're calling gravity. And because it's not very strong, it simply acts as the mechanism to determine up from down. And that's about as easy as I can make it.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, what you're essentially doing is explaining piece by piece that there are not easy, but understandable explanations for how we can define where we live within what could be defined as a closed system, but that's quite a scary word for some people. But you know what I'm talking about when I say a closed system, right, Bob?
oh, absolutely. Yes.
So the idea that we have currently, almost heliocentric globe Earth believers have, is that you have this infinitesimal amount of space with, as you described earlier, you know, millions of light years of gaps between everything. You know, the stars themselves are light years away, and that's vast distances. In reality, what Bob's just explained in detail is us being in a system that has the stars very, very close and are manifestations above us. Now, we have no further details, we have no further studies beyond the lies and nonsense we're fed from NASA. Before we get there, though, I'm hoping to, at this stage, get Stephen Chess into the conversation, because given that we live in this closed system with the sun doing exactly as we observe, this isn't a difficult sell for anybody who's thinking this makes no sense. Well, just step outside and have a look at what they actually do. That's what we are saying they do. It's pretty much as simple as that. But we are all now paying closer and closer attention to what effect that actually has on us versus what we're told it should have with things like seasons, months, days. And Stephen Chess has made an interesting observation, which I'm hoping he's going to run by you now, Bob, will run by the audience. And it's interesting. So I don't know, over to you, Stephen.
Hey, yeah. So to me, it always seems like the temperatures go up and down and up and down, and not just with the seasons, but with each month. So I thought that along with their model, having the sun go higher in when it's the moon is a crescent compared to when the moon is full, would make the sun closer when the moon is full, right? So it does seem like from the last few months that I've been paying attention to this, that when the sun is closer, as in when the moon is full, the temperatures are hotter compared to when the sun or the moon is in crescent.
Right. Yeah, and that's a very interesting observation. And I haven't, you know, made that exact correlation, but it's something that, you know, like I said before the show, I think you can look at it in history of, you know, sun position, moon position, and there very well may be a correlation. And of course, what you just said, Stephen, completely flies in the face of the heliocentric model, because in the heliocentric model, in the wintertime, right, for the northern hemisphere, the sun is closer. So supposedly, which of course that's nonsense, and we know that. There's nothing about that that makes any sense whatsoever. So, however, in the flat Earth model, that could definitely have some legs. It's very possible that that is the case. I have never made that correlation, but I'll certainly be looking for it. and as I told you before the show, also one other observation that we made about this supermoon was that I think that the supermoon, they say that it's, you know, so many miles closer, but I think that there's probably a much better explanation for it in the flat Earth model, in that the supermoon only seems to be that much bigger when it's right on the horizon. And what makes sense about that to me is that the moon and the sun, you know, pretty much track each other. And when it's on the horizon, that would be the furthest away from us that they both are, okay? And of course, then you would have what's called atmospheric lensing, which is causing, you know, depending on not only the distance, but other variables in the atmosphere itself, will cause the moon to look much, much bigger. And in fact, I shot some footage. I'll be showing it on Globebusters this Sunday. I shot some footage yesterday of the sun right on the horizon, and it looked easily, you know, 20 to 30% bigger, easily. I mean, it was a whole lot bigger, but I also sat there and I tracked it as it went up, and the higher it got, of course, the smaller it got. And by the time it was, you know, directly above, it didn't look like it was any bigger or smaller than any other moon during a flat Earth. It's just that this particular time of year, in the fall and the winter time, the sun and the moon are at their, you know, at their furthest distances, and therefore we have a lot more of a magnification effect. Now, one of the things that Cami and I both found interesting yesterday during this supermoon effect is that a lot of people were having problems driving on the highways because the sun was absolutely blinding. It was enormous, right? Well, the sun should not conform to those parameters at all, unless, of course, on the flat Earth model, where it's much, much further away than what they're telling us, you know, in the heliocentric model, which it's supposedly closer. But the sun itself also seems to be much brighter and much more glaring. And we definitely noticed that. So there is a correlation and something that would indicate that both the sun and the moon are a lot closer. Now, the more I think about this, I also think that the sun and the moon aren't really 3,000 miles up either. In fact, Cami and I both think that they're probably considerably higher, and we're looking at a figure of maybe 9,000 to 10,000 miles would be more realistic. But that goes into a whole nother area, but that's just something that we're looking at right now. But entirely possible, Stephen, that could be the case, and I think that we should look at that.
Yeah, I'm just throwing it out there. Everyone can make their own observations and, you know, pay attention.
It's one where as soon as you ran it past me, immediately I thought of, I work outside at night and have done for about 2 or 3 years now. And as a result of what you've just described, through the 28-day moon cycle, you've got this warming and cooling effect month on month. Obviously, it's in relation to the season that you're in, but I have to have lots of different styles of jackets. And it's not like you can just put a winter coat on, because right now it's just that much warmer. So I'm not in these thick clothing. But yet 2 weeks ago, or maybe a bit less, maybe about 10 days ago, on the news they said in the UK it's going to snow, and it was absolutely bitter. Well, it's not. I've got my windows open, you know. But this is within this 28-day that we're experiencing this warming and cooling cycle, again completely flying in the face of anything that the heliocentric model has to offer. But makes perfect sense if we have what Cami describes with the teeter-tottering of the sun and moon, and as Bob's just explained, that if it's at its greatest distance, you have the thickest layer of atmosphere to see through, therefore the greatest magnification, which is kind of adverse to what you might think when you describe it being higher and lower. You would think that at the point that it's closest, but from what you've just said, Bob, am I right that you're saying that when it's at its farthest point on the horizon, you actually have this magnification effect?
Yeah, there would be much more atmosphere for the sunlight to be going through, as well as the moonlight. And of course, we know that there's definitely a lensing effect, a magnification effect. And in fact, I'm beginning to, you know, go along with the thoughts of Peter Lindemann on this, in that it is the atmosphere itself that is actually bringing the energy from the sun, or the light in the sun and the light from the moon, into our visible range. Because, you know, granted, even when you send balloons up in space, you know, or get near space, the sun doesn't seem to be anywhere near as bright as it is up there as it is on the ground. Of course, that could be an interpolation of the camera, but I tend to believe that the sun is actually getting its light energy magnified by the atmosphere itself. And of course, days like yesterday, when the sun is absolutely blinding, that would be a really good proof of that, you know, to kind of throw into that preponderance of evidence if you're going to build a case for that.
You've reminded me of something, which was when Morgile released a video, which was it was someone else's balloon footage, but he mistook the sun and the moon, which lends itself nicely to what you're saying, which is that if you can actually make that error in the footage, it tends to suggest that the atmosphere is definitely giving us some sort of magnification to the effect that they produce.
Absolutely. And of course, that's, you know, what this, as soon as we can figure out what camera to use, because now after the bad luck that Dwayne had, you know, when Jaron and Dwayne were doing that with that particular brand of camera that we were using when we lost our two, that it was failing, the power shutting down, which was then not closing the file properly and corrupting that. So anyway, but I digress. As soon as we find a good camera that works well at night, and we're going to need something with a fairly decent aperture opening, because you're not going to get it done, get the job done with a little bitty GoPro, you know, size aperture. You're going to have a bigger aperture for more light gathering capability, obviously. And of course, the problem with that is the bigger you go in that, the more weight you deal with. So it's been very tricky to find something that's going to do the job where, you know, and I'm very insistent on this when we launched the balloon, that the stars must be visible before we ever let that balloon go up. The camera has to be able to see the stars. And so we have to have a continuous, uncut, you know, shot of the stars spinning around or not. And then of course the instrumentation that we have with the flight computer gives us very precise data as far as the elevation, the GPS position, you know, all that stuff. And, you know, like I said, I'm pretty sure that, you know, you get up 35, 40, 50,000 feet, those stars are going to go poof. And when that happens, you know, what's the explanation going to be? That's going to be a really difficult one for somebody to answer in the heliocentric model.
I mean, I have to tip my hat to you guys for doing these experiments. I really, really admire you for doing them. But at the same time, it kind of fills me with a bit of outrage, because it's something that Jaron actually says quite frequently, which is if he was the head of NASA, he would have answers to these questions tomorrow. And ultimately speaking, we have this team of people bleeding the countries that they are funded by dry to provide us with nonsense. And little old you, no offense, is sending up a balloon, a humble balloon with a few, you know, I'm going to call them this, cheap cameras, to find real information about where we live. That in itself, well, this is a segue into NASA, but that in itself is an outrage. Would you not agree?
Absolutely. I mean, we've paid them to do this, but we also know why they're hiding it, because this is part of the agenda to, you know, for the mind control. Essentially, the first thing you do is you make everything seem like an accident, that nothing is significant, that we're not significant. There's nothing special about us. We're just some sort of cosmic accident. And, you know, when you look at it that way and you introduce religion into it, then it pretty much opens the doorway for people to behave however they want to, and thinking that, you know, well, it doesn't matter anyway because we're just a speck in the blowing in the wind.
I'm going to reiterate that. That's very, very important. I'm glad you've said it, but I'm going to say it again. So for all you watching who think you live on a spinning ball, your life is meaningless. You are literally traveling through the infinite soup of nothingness at ridiculous speeds. And there's 1,000,001 other Earth-like planets that they talk about all the time on the news that could either wipe us out or replace us or have equally little significance in their lives going on. That's the world you live in. You know, you've got a mathematical certainty that there are aliens, that these other planets have life on them. You know, that's a mathematical certainty in your world. In my world, on the flat Earth, on the plane that we live in, that is complete and utter nonsense. To assume that that little orange dot that we call Mars has got any squirrels on it is farcical, you know. But when you realize that, life gets a lot better. It's a lot more peaceful knowing that you're not spinning around, that there's not going to be a giant rock smashing into you, because that's not how we were formed. We may not know how we were formed, but with our humble cameras and humble balloons, we're slowly getting there and getting answers that aren't just spoon-fed to us and indoctrinated into us and, you know, programmed into us. You know, we're actually getting genuine answers. And for me, that's why these conversations with Bob and Stephen and everyone else since I've been doing this are so important, because it demonstrates to all of the people watching that rather than just accepting the information you are spoon-fed, you can actually take charge of finding out at a fundamental level what you are and where you live. That is glorious. As opposed to being insignificant, we are more than capable. We have immense amounts of capabilities within us. That is fantastic. So, you know, sorry to reiterate it, Bob, but I just think it's a really important point.
Oh, I totally agree. And, you know, and that's the whole thing is our tax money is essentially given to NASA, you know, under the guise of exploring our universe and our world, and bringing that information back to we the people. But in fact, the direct opposite is being done. It's being done to give us anything but the truth. The real reality that we live in is kept to the very few, the elite, okay? And then they use it for their own nefarious purposes in trying to make us think that, you know, we're on this ridiculous spinning ball and we're insignificant, and that nothing really matters, when in fact, you know, we are very, very special. And, you know, as far as aliens and other life forms, obviously there's other life forms. We look around and we see, you know, dogs and cats and insects and birds and all kinds of different life forms. But as far as intelligent life forms, you know, that there are on a level like us, or maybe even much more advanced, which, you know, God, if we are the pinnacle of evolution, we're in trouble. But I prefer to think we're more along the lines of infant. We're in our infancy and we're learning more and more about the universe around us. But right now we just happen to be in a reality where everything is very difficult for us. It's made very difficult. And, you know, that we could get into a philosophical area as to why that is. But the reality is that it's not what it is being presented to us as. And that's one of the things that, you know, when somebody starts waking up to the deceptions, as well as the ball earth falsity and the flat earth reality, then we start kind of giving ourselves permission to think outside of the box and looking at things in a much different paradigm than the ones that we've been trained to, you know, these glasses that we've been trained to look through.
I mean,
so
we often on these shows will talk about people who are more heavily indoctrinated, the people who are in the education systems potentially indoctrinating others to perpetuate this lie indefinitely. But I think for yourself, it's been perhaps, I don't know if it's been more or less difficult, because you've worked in communications. You've had a lot of this information about how things like satellites work given to you as an explanation for why things fundamentally do work. You know, you will put things into effect. Has it been more difficult to undo some of the training, that's the right word, I'm sure, when you found this information out?
Not really, because honestly, you know, my training as an engineer is still very applicable, because, you know, even though I worked in satellites and I worked also in terrestrial microwaves, shooting point-to-point microwaves, the only thing that is really different now is the way that I'm looking at those shots, okay, those microwave shots or that satellite shots. As far as the theory and the mechanism to make all that happen, it's still very, very legitimate, right? The only thing that's different is the propagation factor. You simply do not think about curvature of the Earth, or at least I never did, and I doubt many people do, when they are thinking about, you know, these 70 to 100-mile microwave shots that I've made, Robin Poe has made, you know, when she was in the military. I mean, theoretically, that should never happen. And it's, you know, a lot of it was just kind of written off by me, and the fact that, you know, typically when you do these microwave shots, you try and get the highest area, the highest land feature to build your tower on. Okay, so I'm thinking, well, that's it. You know, we're just getting, you know, a nice high ridge, and that's the reason why we're able to make these really long shots. But when you start going back and looking at them, that does not explain everything. Many things should still be way below the horizon, but you're not thinking in terms of the curvature of the Earth should be blocking this microwave signal, which is, you know, 6 gigs and above, which, you know, it does not give well to bending, right? It propagates much like light. And so if you can't see it, if you're not physically in a place where you can see a beam of light, then theoretically the microwave isn't going to work either. But, you know, so for me, no.
Again, I'm going to repeat that because it was something that Robin Poe, it was astonishing when I heard it from her, because she had a little bit more information that was just a little key to how they deceive us. So she was explaining that she was given by the book a certain distance that you'd have to link up these relays, these transmission points, and she couldn't get her relay to work on this particular point, so she just turns it back towards the origin point, which is, you know, 115 miles away, and it works instantly. And as you say, in order to do that, you need direct line of sight. Well, according to the globe maths and all of the laws that they say we should live by on this spinning earth that they say we live on, you shouldn't be able to do that, but you can.
It's straight up impossible. Now, of course, that would not be a factor on the other side, being satellites. Okay, so satellites were a little bit more difficult for me to wrap my head around as being phony, and the reason is because when you deal with satellites and you're dealing with a parabolic dish, you have a very narrow beam width, okay, that the radio signal can propagate. However, satellites are said to have what's called a footprint, okay, on the Earth, and that footprint is kind of in a little elongated circle. And that's the area that they can cover to. However, anybody that has ever set up like any type of ground-based satellite dish, I mean, you get off a degree or two one way or the other, and that signal just goes away, right? So that was something that was very difficult for me to understand until I started understanding that, well, maybe if there is a firmament up there, and this is my first line of thinking, that if there is a firmament up there, maybe they figured out some way to attach these satellites to it, right? And maybe they have, and I don't think so much anymore. And then I started looking at the idea of maybe they're just simply bouncing these off of the dome, which they're calling the ionosphere, and that's what's causing it. And then it's like, no, that doesn't work either, because of, you know, in the ionospheric theory, different charges will cause different conditions as far as propagation. So I kind of let that one go. And then so I went back to the idea of balloons. And the thing that I had the problem with in balloons is that, well, they'd be blowing around up there in the winds aloft, but it turns out that, you know, when you get up to certain levels, you know, above like 60,000 feet, that at 60 and 70,000 feet, that lo and behold, the air can become very calm up there, and that's largely because there is hardly any air density. In fact, when we saw Felix Baumgartner do his jump, right, he was free falling for a good 2 or 3 minutes before the clothes that he was wearing even started to ruffle, right? Which tells me that there really isn't that much of an effect. So it is entirely plausible that you could get a balloon up there and have some sort of station keeping mechanism that kept it in a relatively static enough position where that then you could align dishes on the ground. And that makes perfect sense to me. And in fact, you know, the more I think about that, the more I'm pretty much convinced that that's it. Now, a lot of people have said, well, one of the other things that kind of dissuaded me away from this also is one of the areas when I was working for Western Telecommunications is I used to set up what was called sat phones, okay? And they were basically satellite telephones. And interestingly enough, that there was like a 2 to 3 to 4 second delay, right? And the excuse that was given to us was that, well, it's because you have to be making a 26,000 mile journey up to the satellite and then 26,000 miles down. So you have a 52,000 mile round trip, yada, 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 and there's the reason for your delay. But of course, that much distance would not cause that long of a delay. So what I'm thinking it is more likely to be is more of a digital processing type of phenomenon, because anytime you process a signal digitally, there's going to be a time delay. And I won't go into the technical details on that, but that's pretty much what I'm thinking is the reason for that. And you know, a lot of people have also talked about that the hams are supposedly measuring this very specific delay on the EME moon bounce stuff. Well, I found no proof of that whatsoever. So I think that's kind of a wives' tale. And I'm still actively pursuing trying to find hams that are doing this EME bounce so I could get a little bit closer, you know, to what's actually going on to try and figure that out.
Doesn't that come back to the inverse square law again in terms of the amount of power that's required?
Yes, that's absolutely another one of those things. You have one of the big things is not only the inverse square law, but directly related to that would be RF signal path loss, and not just RF signal, but any type of EM radiation. Light has the same laws that are applied to it exactly. The inverse square law is very much a part of that, and light would have the very same conditions attached to it. Now, of course, when you're putting light through an atmosphere or a light through any other medium like water, it will slow it down, okay? So, but it also attenuates it. It also seems to make it a little bit less in field strength. And that's the whole thing, is that when you start looking at path losses and you actually calculate those path losses, you find that it's simply impossible to have the power of maybe a 100 or 200 watts or even 500 watts go the distances that they're telling us that NASA is sending data back to us from, like Mars or Jupiter, you know, 100 million miles away plus, right? There simply is not enough power to make that happen. Especially when you consider that these little satellites are out there and they're supposedly powered by solar arrays, right? And David Weiss, you know, and I'm sure the commercial ones may be a little bit different, but David Weiss told me, he said, you know, the average solar panel is only about 300 watts, you know, that you see on top of a house, which, you know, I was way overestimating, and I was saying, well, they may be up to 1,000 watts, but not so. So you look at these little bitty ridiculous solar collector arrays that are on the satellites, and they could barely power themselves, let alone any type of power necessary for an RF transmission to traverse 100 million miles or more, or even 500,000 miles going to the moon and back. I'm sorry, but that's just not possible.
I was going to round up there, but I can't go into this subject now. So from memory, and this is a long time since I've looked at it, but you've got the lunar lander, and it's got a couple of car batteries powering it. They scoot around the moon, and then it's got enough power on it to have a remote control signal that's bounced from the orbiter going around the moon to remote control a camera array and film this the lander taking off. You know, the amount of power realistically needed would be phenomenal. I remember seeing you know, 80s on the road, you know, broadcast centers, and it would be cars and cars and cars of stuff to broadcast the signal from an outside location. You know, that was in the 80s. You know, it's just such nonsense.
It really is. And of course, I mean, I can see, obviously it wouldn't be that hard to go from the lunar lander up to, you know, the vehicle in space, because that's probably what, a couple hundred miles up. I don't know. I have no idea what the orbit height was, but that's obviously easy, and you know, it's replicated here on plain Earth all the time. But you know, when you start getting into the hundreds of thousands of miles, that changes the game altogether. And all you have to do is look around you, you know, as to what kind of transmission power is being utilized by, like, AM radio stations, FM radio stations. You know, they're running, like, AM radio stations. I've said many times, we've got KOA here in Denver, which is a clear channel AM radio station at 850 kilohertz. Well, it runs at 50,000 watts. Okay. Now, during the day, that 50,000 watts will pretty much have a decent coverage around the state of Colorado, you know, which may be 300 miles from one side to the other. And you know, and that's about it. Now at night, when the ionosphere drops and the interference or the noise floor also drops and propagation changes, conditions change, then you can hear KOA in a lot of places around the country. Okay, but again, we're talking 50 kilowatts. That's a lot of power, right? And and you go back in time, and I think one of the earlier 1920 or 30s broadcast tests that they did was something that was running like a gigawatt, and it was able to be heard in Hawaii and in Britain at the same time. And I can't remember what that exact experiment was, but it's on YouTube. You can look it up. These are much more realistic figures that it takes to propagate these distances. Now, the only other thing that can change, things like that slightly would be directional antennas, columnating the energy, versus an omnidirectional antenna, because then you don't have to pay quite as much attention to the inverse square law because you're directing your energy in one specific direction, even though the inverse square law still does apply.
Sure, but they still need 50 kilowatts because they've basically got to barrage their signal around any obstacles, haven't they?
Exactly. They have to literally power it around and through things. And of course, the lower frequencies do that much better than the higher frequencies. When you get into microwave, like NASA is allegedly sending these signals back, I think in the 10 to 12 gigahertz range, first of all, amplifier efficiency is horrible, when you get up into those higher frequencies. Secondly, path loss goes up dramatically, not exponentially, but dramatically. So everything that NASA does, they'd stand a better chance, honestly, if they were doing it at like less than 1 megahertz. They'd be able to have a lot better luck, honestly, if you were looking at it. But in my point of view, I don't think that if you were to leave the magnetic influence of this plane and the ether, then radio signals simply could not propagate at all, because they require something to propagate through. And of course, before Einstein came along and annihilated the ether, which was a bunch of BS because the ether absolutely exists, then it worked very well to base the math and the physics on these radio signals propagating through an ether. And whether that ether is some sort of a byproduct of the magnetic model that we're talking about, could also be some other type of exotic energy like prana, or some type of biological type life energy, which of course a lot of people will say is complete woo-woo and pseudoscience and whatever. But like I said, when I did my presentation on pyramids, a lot of people would call that pseudoscience, and yet pyramids absolutely are demonstrable. And I understand, Nathan, you yourself did that experiment with sharpening the razor blade, right?
Yeah, it was on mainstream TV. I mean, I couldn't believe more people hadn't heard of it because it was on a mainstream show about magic, so they were putting their kind of negative spin on it, but it was a simple enough experiment and I replicated it and absolutely it worked.
Yeah, simple things like that. And of course, I did my experiment in the freezer and I haven't done much since then, but I am, like I said, going to be doing a lot of experiments with pyramids, not the least of which is checking food preservation, and many other things. I mean, there's a ton of experiments that anybody can do.
But before we do move on to that, because this is something that you can definitely do, and I want to achieve this at the end of this show, which is to sort of get across the point that all of your satellite signals that are coming into your home are ground-based. This is a certainty for me now. I in no doubt, I was pretty certain just by looking at the angle of attack that they tell us with the, I'm going to excuse my French, their bullshit explanation of how they're pointing at the geostationary satellites, which are, I don't know what's the renaming, geosynchronous as they're now called. But this nonsense explanation. I'll give you a little anecdotal story. So you all know this guy, so Jamie, fake spaceman in space, who I think is now, he was fake clouds in sky and fake sock in sock and various other similar names, explained that he had a analog, if you want to call it that, we'll call it analog, but a ground-based terrestrial TV receiver, and he was picking up one of the satellite stations on it. In other words, they just encrypted it incorrectly, and he was just receiving it, on the wrong signal. But it's the same principle. We now have, I forget when they did the digital, get my tongue around it, the digital switchover, but all they essentially did was introduce error correction and concealment so that you could disguise when you lost or had poor signal. But that was it. You still have the exact same systems. It made me laugh when I thought back to squarials, which anybody in Britain will remember these. We were told that the squarial was a terrestrial based system, but it was essentially a satellite dish, and they sat right next to the ones that we were told were coming from the satellites. But they were next to each other. They looked virtually identical, but we were just given a slightly different explanation. One is coming from terrestrial, which they all are, and the other is coming from satellites. But like I say, they were both lined up in exactly the same way. It was nuts.
Yeah, and that's true too, because what is happening is, yes, I think that these satellite signals are ground-based, and they don't necessarily have to be pointed right at the source, because if you have a high-power ground source, okay, then really the entire reflective part of the parabolic array is unnecessary, because the LNB, or the block converter, has enough sensitivity to simply pick up the close proximity signals, okay? And granted, they are coming from a very specific direction, but obviously then the transmitter would be coming from there. So it makes perfect sense. Now, as far as Jamie saying that he was able to pick up those satellite signals, the only thing that I can say about that is in the olden days, way back a few decades ago, before everything was encrypted and encoded, you could theoretically, and actually not just theoretically, it happened all the time, you could have two signals mix in free space, and this process was called heterodyning, okay? And basically what would happen is you would have two frequencies, two different carrier waves, completely different frequencies. They would mix in free space, heterodyne, and then come up with a new resultant frequency, which, lo and behold, some people would be able to pick up on their TVs and the UHF band or whatever. So, I mean, technically it is possible. It's just not real likely, but it does happen, and it has happened. So I can't necessarily dismiss that.
Cool. Right, last subject, I promise, and then we will round up. I'm sure I've talked about this with you off air a couple of times, which is about the origin of the bubbles in pools, which was when the tether got loose when they were repairing Hubble once. And there was a guy that was intercepting, so he said, the satellite transmissions that were coming from NASA that were supposed to be encrypted but weren't. They were just available for anybody, and he had recorded hours and hours and hours of this footage and found bubbles in them. Now, when I spoke to you about it, you had actually come to this footage through the actual avenue it was spun by the media, which was the alien invasion spin. Can you just maybe give us a little bit more information about how you came to that information and what you think about it now?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I recognize exactly what you're talking about, but I do know about the tether that was, photographed by NASA, and it allegedly broke, right? And so, yeah, that could have been underwater or whatever. But honestly, the thing that really got my curiosity up about that were these little small lights that looked like small Pac-Mans. They literally looked like small Pac-Mans, with a little notch in the front of them. They're kind of going like this and flashing, and it's like, what in the hell are those?
No, we are talking about the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. And so that is an interesting phenomenon to me, and honestly, I don't know what that is. The only thing that I can even remotely compare it to would be a phenomenon called orbs today. Now, a lot of people, again, will say, oh, orbs, that's crazy. I don't know what they are, and I don't know what they are. A lot of people speculate that they are some sort of like small life energy or a soul or whatever. But I can tell you this, that when Jaron, my son, was very little, we had a surveillance camera in his room, right? And we would, be downstairs and we'd put him to bed, make sure that he didn't get out of his crib or anything like that. And it was interesting because we would see these little orbs. As soon as we put him in there, they would just be all over the place and in changing direction, but they were always right around him in particular. And one of the things that we thought was really amazing is that when he was put to bed in a very good mood and he was very happy, the orbs would be literally everywhere. And we do have footage of this recorded. And if he didn't want to go to bed and he was in a really nasty mood or whatever, the orbs would seem to kind of avoid him. But what are they? I don't know. But I can tell you that just by my own observations, they're an interesting phenomenon. And that's the only thing that I can even remotely draw a line to in whatever those things were, the little Pac-Man things that were floating around in space. It's hard to say. So
you've put that beautifully, because you've put it with your almost with your heliocentric hat on. I mean, now would you not just agree that they're just bubbles in a pool?
Uh, I don't see how a bubble could manifest like that, to be honest with you. So, I mean, to me, it's still kind of an enigma. You know, for all we know, though, it could have been some sort of special effects by NASA. But I can't, honestly, I cannot see bubbles behaving like that, especially with the brightening and the slice in the center of it. Nothing that I know about bubbles would ever indicate that as being a bubble. So I'm just going to chalk that up as I have no idea.
Fair enough. Well, it wasn't quite as good a ham-handed segue, maybe we'll call that, into what you've been looking at with Jaren recently, which is, you know, sort of deep sea divers in the pools, or the lack of having divers there. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, you know, I mean, and those bubbles are clearly bubbles, especially when you see, like on the helmet, you'll see them kind of be attached, and they'll slowly kind of move up, and then they'll detach and take off. Clearly, they're underwater, and clearly those are bubbles. And you know, even in Jaren's latest stuff, everybody's coming out and saying those aren't divers. There's some sort of other manifestation. But you know, to me, they're clearly divers, and to a lot of people, they can clearly see divers. And there was a piece of footage that Learn of the Jesuit Order found a long time ago, and he was laughing about it because inside of one of the modules of the space station, you could clearly see a diving tank with a little black stripe around it. You know, I mean, and all it has to be is conclusively shown once when NASA is supposed to be in space, and then, you know, then what do the ballers say? What do the NASA fanboys then say? You know, oh, well, that, you know, I don't even know what they would say, to be honest with you. But here we have it. We're actually able to repeat it. Jaren's found it a few times. We've seen the bubbles in tons of different footages, not only from NASA, but from the Chinese Space Agency, JAXA, Roscosmos. They're all doing the exact same thing, except some do it a little bit better than others, but they're still clearly bubbles.
Right. And about that footage with the divers, when I was looking at it, I could see something that looked like it was coming out, like almost arms. And if you know diving, you know that that's what the tubes coming out from the tank look like. There's four different tubes, because you have a regulator, a second one, and then you have your breathing tube, and then you have an extra breathing tube. So it looks like it's coming out like an octopus. So it definitely does look like it that at times, like there's tubes coming out from the point.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And that makes perfect sense. It really does. Another thing is that if they weren't doing these spacewalks in a pool, then NASA would never have to come back with an asinine fix for a problem of an astronaut almost drowning in space by the use of adding snorkels to a spacesuit. I mean, that is just so silly. It just defies the imagination. And of course, they really didn't have any choice, because it got out, you know, live, you know, so to speak. And they had to then come up with some ridiculous explanation that the fluid could have come from maybe some sort of cooling system or whatever. But it seems to me that if it came from some sort of a cooling mechanism, then that liquid would have probably been lethal almost instantly. So not buying it.
The suit or something crazy like that. Death instantly.
Yep. So, you know, they just keep making excuses, and the NASA fanboys, you know, keep, you know, peddling these excuses as, you know, that's the real reason why. And they never seem to look at all the other anomalies. It's like, why is it you're always in a position to have to make these excuses? And of course, their take on it is, well, you guys just see conspiracies everywhere. Well, to that I say, yeah. And I think that we have a really good reason for seeing conspiracies everywhere. You know, even if you're not a flat earther, but you're a truther, you can see the insanity going on in this world. And the deeper you get into it, you realize that there's nothing, and I mean nothing, that these people won't do to, you know, push forward their agenda. So yeah, we do see these conspiracies everywhere. We also are very cognizant of the fact that we are getting to a point now with our technology and also our skepticism that we are no longer willing to just buy into all these BS little facades that they put on for us. Therefore, the pressure is mounting on the elite now to make some sort of a power play that is either going to take the internet offline so people can no longer collaborate with each other, to get rid of people like me and you and Stephen, who are investigating these conspiracy theories and actually bringing them to the light of day. Or something, but I don't know what it's going to be, but whatever it's going to be, it's going to have to be dramatic, and it's going to have to be dramatic enough to divert the entire world's attention from the things that are going on, from child molestation all the way up to, what is the shape of the place we're really living on. All of these things are coming in on them, from all directions, and like a wounded animal, they're very dangerous right now and very unpredictable. So all I can say is people need to just stay aware.
Definitely. Just so I don't get grief in the comments, I'm going to say this now. The point with that piece that Jaron did with the underwater footage was that there was no footage that didn't have them being assisted. Now, if you were to go to space, you would require at some point them to have training where they were unassisted to make it as real as possible. If the analogy I would give is if you've got an NBA player who's constantly got a guy giving him a leg up every time he does a slam dunk in training, when it comes to a real game, he's never going to be able to make that shot. And the same applies to NASA. They must have footage of them doing those walks, albeit training walks in the tank, without any assistance from divers. But they don't seem to have that.
No, they don't. And Jaron made the point very well. You simply, when they're up there in space, supposedly they're all on their own. And so for them not to be training and being able to do all this stuff unassisted is ludicrous, right? I mean, there's nothing logical about that. And not only that, why are they training in a swimming pool? For neutral buoyancy so that they can get used to the weightlessness? That's ridiculous, because the real problem is why aren't they training in a vacuum? Well, the reason they can't train in a vacuum is they found that regardless of what they do in there, they simply can't survive. If they have an atmosphere that is suitable to give us the proper atmospheric pressure on our body inside the suit, then the suit would be so unbelievably rigid that you wouldn't be able to move any part of it, right? It would have to be a completely mechanized type suit. And of course, what do we see? We don't see anything mechanized like that, which would be the much more logical thing, right? And have the astronaut inside of this suit kind of running, little robotic arms or whatever, that you don't have to worry about stuff like that. But no, they will sit there and give you a 3/16" layered fabric that supposedly is protecting the atmosphere from the vacuum and the cold of space, in addition to providing the correct atmospheric pressure so that he can even survive. It's just ridiculous. And like you said, if you had anywhere near the normal atmospheric pressure inside that spacesuit when you're about ready to go through that airlock door and you step outside, either that suit is going to explode or it's going to become so rigid that the astronaut wouldn't be able to move at all in it.
Absolutely.
Simple physics.
we won't touch on the Russian stop motion animation where his suit does swivel. We'll end it there. I think that's probably a sensible place to finish. So on that note, I'm going to say a massive, massive thank you to Stephen Chess for being on Flat Earth United. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Stephen. Kermit the Gangsta. That's what I always call him because I love his icon. His avatar is awesome.
Yeah, Kermit. And also, Bob, a massive thank you to you too. It's been a pleasure having you.
Well, it's been a pleasure being here, Nathan, anytime, and we'll do it again.
I do hope so. And to all of you who have joined us live, thank you very much for being here. I've been Nathan Oakley. I will see you all in the next video.